Well, the election is over and the political posturing has begun. Here in the Commonwealth of Virginia and across the nation, education is at the top of the order. Here in the Commonwealth, Governor-elect Spanberger and Governor Youngkin spar over UVA board appointments and also the president's search. And also, the state senators may call UVA leaders to the carpet over agreement to end DOJ investigations. Where does this end? Where does it start? And what is the implication of education here in the Commonwealth post the Youngkin administration? And not only that, but the U.S. Department of Education has now continued to dismantle itself. It's State of the Water. I'm your host, Eric Claville, and you're listening to the State of Education here in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Once again, we want to thank you for joining us, as you always do, as we broadcast from the campus of the Norfolk State University, home of the Spartan Nation, from none other than WNSB Hot 91, the soul of VA. You know, on yesterday, we ended our football season here in Spartan Nation. Of course, it was off to an exciting start, and the excitement over the inaugural and first year coach for Coach Vic. A lot of great publicity for the institution. It was a little rocky start, and of course, it ended a little rocky, but at the same time, it is growing pains. They entered it against Howard University in D.C. at the Audi Field. Phenomenal game played. Hats off to all the players. And I'd like to take a moment of personal privilege to congratulate my oldest son, our oldest son, Ian Sebastian Claville, which concluded 5 years of marching band and 3 years drum major at Howard University. Congratulations, son, and looking forward to your graduation from college in the spring. You know, we've been talking about the election wrap up, and we've done that, and we're looking at now where things stand as relates to issues. So moving forward, we're going to take a look at today at issues that are at the top of the order. Now, of course, you know, given what's happening in our government, especially in Trump 2.0, there's a lot of things changing very rapidly. And of course, this is by design. So we know that things will change and continue to change. And there's going to be a butting of heads when it comes time for midterm elections in 2026. So January 2027, look for the last 2 years of the Trump administration and Congress to be very contentious, and we'll see where things land. But we're getting a head start here in the Commonwealth because guess what? We just had an election, which yielded us a new executive house, executive officers, really, with the governor-elect, lieutenant governor-elect, and attorney general-elect, and a new slate of legislators in the House of Delegates. That's right, with a super majority, for the most part, in the House at 64-36 in favor of Democrats, and, of course, the slim majority in the Senate, with the other vote now being the governor-elect. So more of a cushion there. So what we find now is that a lot of the laws, a lot of the executive orders, a lot of the things under the Youngkin administration now, they're going to find it's going to be a major pushback, and also more than likely a turning of the tide, especially a lot of things that came out of the executive office and through executive orders, which have the power of law, the force and power of law, but can be reversed through executive order as well, or changed through the legislature, because now the veto pen does not fall in the way of anything that the legislature wants to do, given that the governor-elect is also a Democrat. But with that being the case, one of the most important and impactful, I would say, issues surrounding us as Virginians and really the entire country and the world, and that's education. We know that education was definitely at the forefront and on the chopping block of various programs and policies and standards as it relates to the Youngkin administration. And of course, we know it's happening here on the federal level. Now, at 12:30, we're going to delve more into the topic of the dismantling of the U.S. Department of Education. We're going to delve into that at 12:30 on the Claville Report, Law, Policy, and Politics. So make sure you come back and tune into the Claville Report there. But one thing I will say about that is that impacts education across the board, with it moving various actions of the Department of Education to different agencies, and also really the protecting of civil rights. But tune back in at 12:30, and you'll hear us break that down in depth for you as reported. But today we're going to look on this show at 10 o'clock. We're going to look at what's happening here in higher ed as it relates to our flagship institution and the Trump administration itself. So what's happening? What's going on? On November 14th, as reported by VPM, NPR affiliate PBS, and also other news outlets, the governor-elect asked the University of Virginia to halt its search for a new leader. Now, the reason being is that the move comes, according to VPM, is that the university has been on the hunt for a new leader since the departure of former President Jim Ryan. Now, we all know, I'll let you know that Jim Ryan himself this was in June of this year. He stepped down in large part because of an agreement with the DOJ for them not to proceed with violation of civil rights. Now, we're going to delve into that in just a moment as relates to what the senators want to do. Because, again, it's a lot of moving parts here. But, they're targeting UVA. But it's not just UVA. It's going to impact all of us. But this is the top of we call it the tip of the spear, right? It is the flagship institution of our state institution here in the Commonwealth. Very similar to other states, they have a flagship institution that is public, such as Texas. They have the University of Texas at Austin, and so forth and so on. So when you take a look at what's happening, look at education, look at the flagship institutions as far as higher ed goes, and you'll see the trends that are coming down the pipe. So according to VPM, Spanberger, a UVA alumna, said she is, quote unquote, deeply concerned over recent developments and how the challenges may impact the legitimacy of the current search for the university's next president. Now, when she mentions the challenges, we're talking about what's happening on the level of the federal agency, the U.S. Department of Education, and more specifically, the White House, and through the White House, the Department of Justice. So, in other words, it's not just what's happening here in the Commonwealth, but what's happening on the federal level. Not only that, but we also know that the legislature and the governor gets to appoint board members to universities and all committee and commissions in the state. So, that also may change as well. Well, definitely will change. But let's take a look at what's also being said. She says, over the past 6 months, the actions of the Board of Visitors have undermined the public's and the university community's confidence in the board's ability to govern productively, transparently, and in the best interests of the university. Now, Spanberger-elect wrote the board, Rector Rachel Sheridan, and Vice Rector Porter Wilkinson. Now, currently, there are 5 vacancies on UVA's board because they have failed, quote, to achieve confirmation by the General Assembly, unquote. Now, according to this is according to Spanberger's letter, but of course this is all public record as well. But UVA's board features 17 governor-appointed voting members who hold 4-year terms, and all of the members of the UVA boards were appointed by current Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin. So, just one more point as relates to this. Earlier this year, Democrats on the Senate Privileges and Education Committee rejected 8 of Youngkin's appointees to open seats on the Board of Visitors at 3 public institutions, including UVA, and the Virginia Supreme Court recently heard arguments filed over those board appointments. Now, I want to go back just a moment to take a look at what Governor-elect Spanberger wrote to the board itself. Basically, she said since June, when you look at Jim Ryan stepping down, or really a little bit before that time period, she said the actions of the Board of Visitors have undermined the public's and the university community's, number one, confidence to govern productively, transparency, and also govern in the best interests of the institution. Now, when we take a look at UVA, when we take a look at the history of it, it is definitely one of the great institutions in the country and really in the world. Is well endowed, is well funded, and a lot of great things come out of UVA. But it's also been a university and an institution that's changed over the years, like all higher ed institutions during the time of segregation integration, and then now the era of what we call DEI and the attacks upon it from the administration. Part of that, what we see, is that the administration wanted all institutions, public institutions, to stop doing something, and that is sponsoring programs that are quote-unquote racially identifiable, or to help students of color, help them in school and assimilate to the university settings that they're around. And those institutions, that includes scholarships as well, and those institutions that did so, they quote-unquote now violate the civil rights agreement or civil rights law under interpretation under the Trump administration, and they are bound to be investigated. They're also bound to pretty much be stripped of some funding. And I'll tell you how that's going to happen in just a moment and what is getting ready to take place right now. Policy being drafted in order to impact not just the Ivy Leagues or not just the flagship institution, the $1 billion flagship institutions of our country like UVA, but all institutions of higher education. So right now, according to what we're looking at, the Supreme Court, they heard arguments now. So we'll find out what happens very shortly with that. But because of that, Spanberger, governor-elect, believes that the board's, quote, composition is now in violation of statutory requirements, further calling into question the legitimacy of the board and its actions. So in a page-and-a-half letter, Spanberger also said that Ryan's departure was, quote, a result of federal overreach, unquote, that had been unchallenged by the board. So the search for a university president is the most consequential action a university board can undertake. And in all cases, such a search, as she wrote, must be conducted through a legitimate and transparent process, according to Spanberger-elect. Robert Hardy was rector when Ryan resigned, and his term expired June 30th, just a few days after Ryan's resignation announcement. Now, Hardy was first appointed to UVA board in 2008 by then Governor Tim Kaine and served second consecutive term after being reappointed by Governor Terry McAuliffe. And in 2021, he was elected vice rector while then Governor Ralph Northam was in office. His 12 years of service to the board were mostly under Democratic leadership. So what ended up happening is you see the pushing out of certain board members, well, the expiration, well, the pushing out, and then, of course, the pushing out of the president. Now, earlier this week, Hardy was named to Spanberger's inaugural committee. And in August, Paul G. Mahoney, a law professor, was named interim president. And a nationwide search was underway for the university's 10th president. Currently, that search is in phase 3 of its 4-phase process, which we know kicked off in July. Now, so that's one side of it. But now let's take a look at the other side. Now, again, Spanberger-elect, which is governor-elect, she stated that basically the overreach of the Trump administration caused the board itself to push out the president. So, of course, he didn't want to go, but he made a decision in the best interest of the institution, given the circumstances in which they are being impacted. And really, all of us are being impacted by these circumstances. But what did the current governor say? Now, on last Thursday, Governor Youngkin, who is still governor until the swearing in of Governor-elect Spanberger, responded to Spanberger's letter with a 2.5-page letter. When he met with her last week, there was a discussion around university boards and operations. Now, quote, he says, "You very briefly mentioned sending a letter about the University of Virginia, but moved to a different topic so quickly that it seemed unimportant at the time," Youngkin said. He says, "I am advised that this was likely the first time in the history of our Commonwealth that a governor-elect attempted to interfere with the governance of a university and the fiduciary duties of individual board members." So that's unquote. Youngkin's letter also accused Spanberger of trying to, quote, bully or micromanage, unquote, the board of visitors. And he felt compelled to respond due to the breach of protocol and inaccuracies in her letter, also saying that she and her transition team have reached conclusions before learning all the facts surrounding Ryan's resignation. Youngkin also wrote that Spanberger's letter was riddled with hyperbole and factual errors. Also, both the board and the current presidential search And in his letter, he also mentioned that the university's agreement with the Federal Department of Justice, which he said was extraordinarily fair and favorable to the university and Commonwealth. He also stated that Spanberger's actions inflicted significant damage on the university. He says that she professes to love. Now, of course, this is reported by VPM, pulled straight from the letter written by Governor Youngkin in response to the letter written by Governor-elect Spanberger. He said, noting that his Democratic predecessors, current U.S. Senators Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, said that decisions on UVA's leadership belong solely to his board and board of visitors. Now, during Youngkin's term, he has said he worked hard to make sure that his appointees were free of political interference and were individuals with extraordinary skills, competence, and experience necessary to manage the higher education institutions of the Commonwealth. And he said it's dangerous to woefully disparage committed individuals who volunteer to serve on university boards and the serious work that they do. Again, this is very interesting because now, for the first time that I can remember, you have a governor-elect and a governor sparring over what has taken place as it relates to board appointments, more specifically board appointments as it relates to the resignation of the former president, Jim Ryan. Unprecedented. But again, here in this era of education, in this Trump era 2.0, everything seems to be unprecedented. So where do we go from here? What is the impact as it relates to citizens, to future students, and the Commonwealth when it comes to our flagship institution? Well, it's Stay the Water. I'm your host, Eric LaVille, and you're joining us today as we delve into the topic of the hour, and that is education. We know that the Trump administration has started to move forward with dismantling the agency from within because it cannot be done so. Only Congress can do it. The president can't do it. However, its Secretary of Education has vowed to do so internally. At 12:30 today on the Clavier Report, Law, Policy, and Politics, I'll delve into that as we break that down and see the impact that particular action, those actions by the president will have. But now what we're dealing with is here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, the actions and the overreach as it relates to Spanberger, Governor-elect's letter to the Board of Visitors at UVA. And of course, it is public knowledge now, where she calls an overreach of the federal government, which has caused the board to be ineffective, to not act productively, and also not transparently in, number one, oppose to the university's really their values is what you're saying, and the community of the university itself and the Commonwealth. And of course, the governor saying that this was definitely an overreach by the governor-elect in order to write this and we're letter to the board members of UVA, which he believes is in direct interference with board's governance and leadership. And as he said, his predecessors, Democratic U.S. Senators Tim Kaine and Mark Warner, who were also governors of the Commonwealth, said that the board's university leadership lies in the hands solely of the board. So again, they're going back and forth over these letters. They're going back and forth over who believes what the facts really are, and also the impact. So we know the facts. We know what's happening. But again, you could take the facts and you can analyze them and at the end of the day come to a different conclusion. And that's what we see here. But what does the legislature do, right? So we know that we have the governor and who that has the power to appoint board members, but the legislature, they have to approve them. And we know that the legislature that did not approve 8 of those board members, including those from UVA. So according to Virginia Mercury, they stated, this was last week, November 17, state senators may call UVA leaders to the carpet over the agreement to end DOJ investigations. State senators are considering asking the representatives from the University of Virginia to meet with lawmakers in Richmond after school leaders signed an agreement with the federal government to suspend multiple civil rights investigations, sparking opposition from legislators, alumni, and faculty. Now, of course, according to Virginia Mercury, this news comes just days after Governor-elect Abigail Spanberger asked the university's board to wait till she's in office before selecting a new president, and after former President Jim Ryan's account of the process that led to his resignation was published on Friday of last week. Now, Ryan wrote that his ouster amid downward pressure from federal officials still feels surreal and bewildering. Matter of fact, Ryan said that Rector Rachel Sheridan and Vice Rector Porter Wilkinson worked with the Department of Justice and Governor Glenn Youngkin's office in pressuring him to resign during the federal agency's investigation. He said the governor's office did not immediately respond to the claims, according to Virginia Mercury. Now, of course, we heard what the governor wrote in his letter, saying that, she didn't know the facts. There were errors that were there, that, he believes that they governed themselves, and she reached conclusions that weren't fair. The governor-elect was basically stating, for the most part, backing up what Jim Ryan, former president of UVA, said himself. As a matter of fact, the president said himself that him resigning was from the pressure from the federal officials. And not only that, but he said that he worked with the vice rector of UVA and Governor Youngkin's office, where they pressured him to resign. Now, keep in mind, the governor appointed all members to UVA board, so every member that's on there now is a Governor Youngkin appointee. And working with the governor's office, he said, it was pressure. Matter of fact, it was so much pressure, he still says to this day. Now, we're 6 months post. He said to this day, it still feels surreal and bewildering to him. So let's see what's going to happen or may happen as it relates to the legislature. Before we do that, what I want to do is take a look at the DOJ investigations, look at the background of that. What was actually happening that caused the UVA president to say, you know what, I think I got to step down. I think the best thing for me to do is resign. What was that pressure that he was feeling? Now, according to Virginia Mercury, to suspend the DOJ investigations, UVA had agreed to comply with civil rights laws and to provide quarterly reports to the government on its compliance efforts. Now, if UVA fails to make sufficient progress toward compliance with the DOJ, it will have 15 days to address the issues before the agreement is terminated and investigations resume. As a matter of fact, according to that, Majority Leader Scott Servell, Democrat out of Fairfax, and Senate President Pro Tem Louise Lucas, NSU alum, Democrat out of Portsmouth, signed a letter to Rector Rachel Sheridan and Mahoney asking them to reconsider their agreement and to, quote, defend the university's autonomy, Virginia's sovereignty, and the constitutional limits on federal power, unquote. As a matter of fact, in the letter, it was stated that Thomas Jefferson founded this university to be a beacon of enlightenment and independence. And it should not become a cautionary tale of capitulation to federal overreach, unquote. So, of course, in response, UVA leaders doubled down on their decision, saying the school suspended costly and disruptive investigations, avoided financial and operational risk, preserved institutional autonomy and academic freedom, and that compliance does not require major changes, which, of course, it requires some changes. You had to stop DEI programs. And, of course, that DEI, everything, it was very broad what you had to stop and put under that. And, of course, when you talk about costly investigation, UVA has money, but, again, any litigation is costly. But also, UVA leaders said that they had not given up any administrative or statutory constitutional protections, unquote, after signing the agreement, and said the agreement would allow UVA to litigate only if and when the DOJ's interpretation of the law diverges from UVA's policies. So the question is, what are UVA policies? Have they adopted policies that are congruent with the guidance of the federal government, more specifically the Trump administration? If that is the case, then, of course, they would not litigate because the DOJ is in line with the policy of UVA because they are the policies of the Trump administration. So, on one hand, you say that sounds great. On the other hand, you say, well, it's really the same thing. So that's the background of the investigations. Now, let's see what actually they could meet when we look at UVA maybe on the agenda. So during the spring, the U.S. Department of Justice, according to Virginia Mercury, initiated its investigation on the institution due to its concerns that UVA was violating federal civil rights laws in its admissions, hiring, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and that his campus culture was inhospitable to Jewish students. The school refuted all these allegations. Now, keep in mind, this is the same university that had the Tiki Torch March. The claims conflicted with President Donald Trump's executive orders aimed at reforming universities to align with his administration's views. Now, of course, we know this situation, according to Virginia Mercury, drew national scrutiny, criticism, which was close to home with Democratic lawmakers now considering calling university board members to account in the near future. Now, with this, Senator Locke, Mamie Locke, who is the chair of the Senate Subcommittee on Higher Education, told Virginia Mercury in an interview last week, "I'm not doing anything right now, but not that I won't." She also said her colleagues will discuss higher education in Virginia and other subjects at a Senate Finance and Appropriations Committee retreat at Raff University beginning on last week, Thursday. She also said a discussion could help determine the Senate's next step. In addition to that, we know that last month, Senator Craig Deeds, Democrat out of Charlottesville, asked Senator Mamie Locke, Democrat out of Hampton, to consider calling UVA leaders to Richmond. His district encompasses that particular institution. Also, doing the same time, Delegate Katrina Carlson of Albemarle, Democrat, and Deeds wrote a letter to UVA interim president Paul Mooney and the board of visitors expressing their disappointment with the decision and calling for them to reverse, quote, this surrender of institutional autonomy and reject further federal interference, unquote. As a matter of fact, the Virginia Mercury asked Senators Chris Head, Republican out of Beaufort, and please forgive me if I mispronounce that region, and then also Todd Pillen, a Republican out of Washington County, who sit on the subcommittee for comment, but they did not immediately respond. So that's where the senators sit. That's what may happen. Now, what will happen, of course, the governors themselves and the governor and the governor-elect, they also weighed in on it through their letters. So you see, everybody is weighing on this very important issue. You may say that it'll be over soon. They'll figure it out. But the real issue that we have here is the freedom and autonomy of education. Higher education is on the chopping block. That is the reason for these inquiries. But not only that, but also how far can the federal government reach? What is that intrusion? And how can leaders of institutions fight back? And what will happen in the fight when we look at the flagship institution of the Commonwealth fighting against the White House led by President Donald Trump and his Department of Education and Department of Justice? Well, one thing about it is that the voters voted, and they voted for change. They voted for a reverse of actions. So get ready for a fight. I'm locked in myself. I'm paying attention to everything that's happening because at the end of the day, what affects one institution affects us all because we're all Virginians and we all are Americans. Once again, we want to thank you for joining us for this edition of Stay the Water, where we bring movers, shakers, and policymakers to you to discuss issues important to the community. Make sure you tune back in at 12:30, where we continue this discussion about education on the federal level. Until next time, be good, be great, God bless, and we'll see you next week.
Hi, I'm Carrie Washington, and you're listening to State of the Water with award-winning host Dr. Eric Claville.